Hello and welcome to Interpreting India, a podcast presented by Carnegie India. Every 2 weeks, we bring to you voices from India and around the world as we unpack the role of technology, the economy, and foreign policy in shaping India's relationship with the world. I'm Anirudh Burman, and I will be guest hosting this episode of Interpreting India. On February 1, the India government introduced the Union Budget on the floor of the Lok Sabha. This budget was introduced in the context of an economic downturn that many are calling structural in nature. Stakeholders were interested in seeing what steps the government would take to address this issue while maintaining fiscal discipline at the same time. In this episode of Interpreting India, we aim to analyze the Union Budget 2020, its approach towards addressing India's economic slowdown, and its larger implications for the Indian economy. To discuss the budget, I'm joined today by my colleague Suyash, who is a fellow at Carnegie India. His research focuses on the political economy of economic reforms and the performance of public institutions in India. Suyash, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you, Anirudh, for having me on the show.
To start off, can you reflect on the context in which this union budget was presented and the expectations from the budget?
So, as you know, Anirudh, there's been a slowdown in GDP growth rate. There have been 6 consecutive quarters of growth slowing down. And the most recent quarter for which we have the data, the July-September quarter, the GDP growth was at 4.6%, which is very low. And even if you look at the components of GDP, other than the government expenditure, or the consumption expenditure financed by government, all other components have been growing at a very slow rate. That's the main context. Other than that, in December and January, consumer price inflation had increased quite significantly. It was about 7.4, 7.6% in these 2 months. And that's well above the inflation target that is given to the Monetary Policy Committee. So we are going through an economic slowdown and inflation seems to be picking up. So it was a very difficult context to be presenting a budget, which, as you know, in India is a master document for all policy pronouncements.
Right.
It's not just about the bookkeeping of the government, but also creating sentiments, building confidence in the economic strategy of the government. These were the expectations. And that was the context in which the budget was presented.
Right. And I think in this context, the finance minister presented an unusually long budget. What are the 2-3 major takeaways you would like us to think about or to reflect on?
The main takeaway from the budget is that the government is trying to achieve fiscal expansion while also facing a very difficult fiscal situation. So because the economy is slowing down, it seems that the government is mindful of the need for it to spend more and boost up the economy. So as I was just saying, that the only component of the GDP that is growing rapidly is the government finance consumption expenditure. For the rest, all other components, private consumption expenditure, capital formation, other net exports, all these are not growing very rapidly. So government is mindful of that and wants to create expansionary fiscal policy and implement it. But it faces a very difficult time. So in 2018-19, there was a big shortfall on tax collections. Compared to the budgeted tax collection, the actual tax collection was much less. 18% was the projected tax collection growth, and they got only 9%. And 2019-20, it's been even more difficult. The gross tax revenues have grown at only 3% year on year. So that's the main source of fiscal stress. Other than that, every year you have some things going well, some things going badly. But in spite of this difficult fiscal situation, from 2018-19 to 2019-20, as they reported, they managed to achieve a fiscal expansion of 12.2% GDP to 13.2% of GDP. So the total government expenditure was 12.2% of GDP in 2018-19, and it is now reported with the revised estimate at 13.2% of GDP in 2019-20. And it is now again budgeted to increase to 13.53% of GDP in 2020-21, which is the coming year for which the budget was presented. Now, if you look at the 2019-20 fiscal expansion, right, substantial, right, 1% of GDP, it was made possible by a few things which are one-off. I mean, you can't do them all the time. Three key factors contributed to it. First, RBI gave an extraordinarily high dividend to the government, and that was basically a conflict between RBI and the central government on how much economic capital the RBI should keep. There was a committee set up to look into it, and there was some resolution of that conflict. And the one outcome was that RBI gave a very large dividend to the government this year. The second big factor that enabled this kind of fiscal expansion is that that in center's tax collection, part of it goes to states. Now, in any given year, the center only comes to know at the end of the year how much is its total tax collection in actual tax collection. While during the course of the year, it keeps sharing the tax with the states. Right. And what happens is that if the actual tax collection in a given year is lower than the tax estimate, the revised estimate for that year, then in the following year, the government gives the state less or more, depending on how the actual tax collection has been, to adjust. And in 2019-20, there is about 59,000 crore rupees less given to the states to adjust for 18-19 tax collection shortfall. Because the actual tax collection in 2018-19 was much less than what was reported at the revised estimate stage. So that freed up a large, about 0.4% of GDP roughly of fiscal space for them. It's like a one-off. And that helped. And the third factor that helped is they invoked the escape clause in the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, which is the budget law for India, which allows the government on certain grounds to breach the fiscal deficit limit that it has set for itself. And this time the limit they had set was 3.3% of GDP, but they have actually reported 3.8% of GDP in the revised estimates. And they have added a statement, a 3-paragraph statement saying that this has been done because of structural reforms such as the corporate tax cut that was given last year. So late last year, they had done a restructuring of the corporate tax rates, and that has cost them something. And they're saying that because of that, they have expanded. They will do this year. But if you were to look forward and whether in 2021 they'll be able to achieve the fiscal expansion, I don't know, because these two of these factors are one-off. They're not going to repeat themselves again. So that was one big takeaway, trying to achieve fiscal expansion in the midst of a fiscal crisis. Couple of other takeaways. One is that there are certain budgetary practices that had questionable budgetary practices that had crept into the budget making process in the recent years, especially from 2017-18 onwards, which have now been normalized. So let me explain. So what government has been doing very extensively from 2017-18 onwards is to use extra budgetary resources for its own expenditure. So these are two types of resources. One is that some government-owned firm, some government-promoted firm, public sector enterprise, issues bonds which are fully serviced by government. Mm-hmm. Interest as well as principal is paid by government, but it doesn't sit on the government's books.
Right.
It sits on the public sector enterprises right. books. And it is used, the money is used for payment for Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, Swachh Bharat Yojana, other government schemes, subsidy schemes. So there is nothing to do with the public sector enterprises business or commercial activities. So they have been using that as a way to pay for schemes. The other is there's been a lot of lending happening from the small savings fund, which is the postal savings fund, to public sector enterprises for, again, government subsidy or services schemes. And these are the two types of primarily extra budgetary resources that have been used more extensively from 2017-18 onwards. And now in the budget speech, whether I heard it and I read it also, they've made it more formal and it seems to have been normalized that we will continue to do this.
So what does normalization mean? How do you...
Now they have added an annex to the budget speech, specifically listing out the extra budgetary resources.
Okay.
And they have also, for example, in food subsidy, what used to happen until last year is that in the beginning of the year, they used to put a large amount in the budget. During the course of the year, they used to release less. And the remaining used to be borrowed by the Food Corporation of India from the small savings fund primarily. From this year, they have put the budget amount also as less. So they've reduced the budget amount itself, and they have just put in the budget itself that Food Corporation will borrow from the small saving fund to pay for the food subsidy. Because Food Corporation of India is the organization that implements essentially the food subsidy, because it procures the grains at some price and releases it at lower price, and the difference is primarily mainly that's the food subsidy in India. So that's the second big takeaway. And the third takeaway is more on the fiscal marksmanship, that I think year after year we are getting the fiscal marksmanship wrong. That we put some numbers in terms of in the budget about how much we'll collect on taxes, how much of the non-tax revenues we'll collect. Year after year, we get the spectrum auction project budgets wrong because we're not able to foresee what's going to happen. But even in tax, we're not able to not even the same ballpark. There's a huge difference between what is budgeted and what is actually realized.
We also underachieve on disinvestment.
So disinvestment is another big problem in which we are not able to project in the beginning, and that's in the nature of the beast itself. There's a process of doing the transaction which we are not able to manage during the course of the year. We make some projections at the beginning, but we are not able to meet at the end. But on that, one point that I also took away from the budget on disinvestment is that because this is a tough time, it's a fiscally stressful time, it has created some impulse in the government to try and make big ticket transactions. Right. So as you know, they've been trying to sell Air India. They've not succeeded yet, but they're trying. They've also recently approved large public sector corporations like Bharat Petroleum, Container Corporation. They are very big ticket transactions. If they go through, they'll be very large transactions. Right. They have also announced listing and kind of partial disinvestment of Life Insurance Corporation. And these kind of things you couldn't have done at a normal fiscal time. So that's another, I would say, takeaway perhaps.
So on the issue of fiscal marksmanship, what do you think is driving this? Why is the government getting it wrong consecutive years? What's the issue?
I don't know. I think that question the people in budget division can answer well. But one part of it has got to do with GST. It's a new tax. It's a big reform that is happening, and it will take its time to stabilize. And it is very difficult to make projections on GST collection at the beginning of the year. So part of it has got to do with that. But we're also getting it wrong in other types of taxes. So direct taxes also. And I think there is something going wrong in understanding of how economic activity is going, projection of economic activity. Because ultimately, taxation is on income and consumption. So if you're not able to make good projections on how income and consumptions are going, you will end up getting your tax projections wrong. On spectrum, again, it seems like there's some kind of a disconnect between even an elementary understanding of what's happening in the telecom sector and what's put in the budget. They have put a very large target this year, more than 1 trillion rupees, 1.3 trillion rupees for spectrum auction. And you know what's happening in the telecom sector. These firms are in a deep financial stress, and how will they be able to raise? So I think the basic commonsensical application of, understanding and application of what is happening in the economy is missing in making the projections. And that's then leading to these kind of problems. And it's also tied to the problem of extra budgetary resources, that even if you get the projections wrong, you're able to find ways to get money into these schemes and other things that you have committed for, because your sense of the hard budget constraint is not quite there. Because you put some budget at the beginning and put some inflated expectation on tax collection and other kind of collections. But during the course of the year, you were wrong. That would be painful otherwise. But now that you can move part of that expenditure to off-budget, extra budgetary resources, that sense of hard budget constraint is also missing. So there's less discipline overall in the budget management system. And that makes it easier for you to get away with poor fiscal management.
Right. The other question I had was just to come back to this issue of borrowing from small savings funds. Do you think there'll be some long-term adverse consequence on the fund itself? Because there's a lot of borrowing from the small saving fund taking place.
So because the borrowing is, most of it is going to either governments or public sector enterprises. And when it's going to public sector enterprises, there's an understanding, it seems, that over time government will keep making good on the promise to pay the public sector enterprise for incurring the bill. So it will continue. The system will continue for the foreseeable future. It's not going out into other domains. But as you see, there's a shortfall in the small savings fund. There's more than 1 trillion rupees of gap between the total value of the investment that the fund has and the total liability that it has. And it's been expanding. Year after year, that shortfall has been expanding. Someday this issue will come to a head and some government will have to put up some money. It's not a given because it's a public account and it's not a given that it's the government's liability. I mean, it's included in the public debt, this liability on it, but it is not a given that at some point government has to put in this 1 lakh crore rupees and it'll have to make good on it. It'll have to make a decision someday on it. But that shortfall is expanding, and year after year, it's been just kind of can is being kicked down the road.
So we are effectively just pushing out the burden onto a future parliament or a future government.
Yeah, future generations.
Yeah. Coming back to this idea of providing some kind of a stimulus in the context of the economic downturn, this year's budget also, it increased the government's capital expenditure by about 20%. That's what they're estimating. And at the same time, they've tried to reduce income tax slabs. So is this going to be effective? Or do you think there was scope to do something different or something more?
So on the capital expenditure, it's true that they've achieved a modest increase. So from 1819 to 1920, there's been a small increase in the capital expenditure as a percent of GDP. So year on year percentage would make sense. You have to look at the normalize it through the GDP. So it was 1.6% of GDP 1819 and 1920, and they've got to more than 1.7% of GDP as far as I remember. But if you look at the overall situation, that capital expenditure is a very small part of the government budget. I mean, it's much smaller than it should be in a country like India. We need to invest much more in building capital assets. Even in defense, we should be spending much more on defense modernization, putting more on buying weapons and building more technical capabilities. In infrastructure, we should be putting in money. Government is intent to do that, but it's not putting actually serious money. In this year, they've achieved a modest increase. That's for sure. It should help if it's implemented properly and so on and so forth. On the income tax side, I'm much more optimistic about this new structure. I mean, how and what kind of impact it will have. Okay. So they've given an option to individuals, and if you have any savings and if you invest those savings in tax exempt avenues and where deductibles are there, then you will be able to benefit from the old system, right, more or less. I mean, depends on your specific financial situation. But if you don't have any savings and you basically end up spending everything, then this new structure might help you more. Mm-hmm. Then you will end up paying less tax, and that additional money that is in your hand may help boost some of the consumption expenditure at the lower middle class and level. That was the kind of middle class, lower middle class level, those kind of incomes. It will help you a little bit on the consumption side. Yeah. But it's a very empirical question. You have to see. I mean, we don't observe sitting here how people will choose between these two different options that they have been given.
Right. This also presumes that at least part of the downturn is because of a slowdown in consumption. That if you put more money in a consumer's hands, you're going to see some kind of a revision or uptake of the economy.
Yeah, there is a slowdown in consumption. It also shows up in the GDP numbers. It's been also been reported by different sectors, from FMCG to automobiles to various sectors, that their sales have been falling. And GDP also, you see that there's a slowdown in the rate of growth of private consumption. Until recently, it was one of the drivers of growth. Only government consumption expenditure and private consumption expenditure were driving growth. Exports and investments are not picking up. But now even that has slowed down. So they're trying to put some more money in people's hands so they can spend more.
So on the issue of this fiscal expansion, what do you think is the long-term sustainability to be able to do this? You pointed to the fact that they've already used the escape clause in the FRBM. Do you think if the economy does not start improving sufficiently within a year or two, that there is increased scope for fiscal expansion, or will a very radically different approach have to be taken?
Yeah, so there's only so much you can do with the fisc, because you have a lot of commitments that are anyway going, and did not have the marginal space to reallocate resources to new avenues is limited, especially if you take politics into account. For example, you can do some expenditure substitution from subsidies to, say, capital expenditure.
Right.
You can, but politically, is that feasible? I mean, governments are finding it very hard in India to do that. Although there's a lot of evidence to show that a lot of subsidies that go, I mean, not just the major subsidies like food, petroleum, fertilizer subsidies, but also other subsidies that go into railways, and a lot of it goes to people who can actually afford to pay and should be able to pay. We should not subsidize the consumption. But still, we are finding it very difficult. Politically, governments are not able to do much about those. So that's one pathway through which FISC can do more. You can do substitution of expenditure while not increasing the overall pie, but doing more with that. But if you want to talk about if the economy doesn't pick up, then can you just keep borrowing more and spending more? Today, for example, our primary deficit is about 0.7% of GDP in 2019-20. That's the amount we're borrowing to repay debt. Primary deficit is borrowing to repay debt. So it's not borrowing to make a capital expenditure or anything like that. It's just borrowing to repay debt. That is not sustainable beyond a point. I mean, you will get into debt sustainability problems, especially now that you have an inflation targeting regime in which you can't just inflate away your debt. You'll end up at some point, maybe not in 5 years or 10 years, at some point you'll end up meeting a moment of reckoning. But I look at it more on a short to medium term basis. If you look at the overall household financial savings in India, most of them are currently being cornered by either central or state government or by public sector enterprises. Very little is left for private sector to use. And we are a capital control intensive economy. We have many capital controls in place. It's not a free flow of capital. So if there is a problem of a constant sum game here, if the governments and the public sector enterprises corner so much of the household financial savings,
there's very little left.
There's very little left for people to borrow and invest, and their cost of borrowing will certainly go up. And you see that. You see whenever government expands its fiscal deficit or borrows more on budget or off budget, the bond yields go up.
So one more question I wanted to ask you about was this whole idea of talking about a number of schemes or projects without a clear sense of what is going to be the fiscal outlay or the expenditure impact. For example, this year's budget has starting a study in India program for foreign students. And it has some stuff about, say, building best practices on disaster resilience. And it's not clear from the budget what amounts are being allocated for it, what is the desired outcome, and so on. What is your take on this?
So there are two parts to it. One is that the budget speech is often used for making policy announcements, which may or may not have fiscal consequences. I don't like that practice because budget should be about budget. Budget speech should be about the budget, but they do use it. The other problem is more to do with the fiscal management approach that we have, especially expenditure management approach. We have this approach that if a problem comes up from some department or a ministry or some proposal comes, we create a small scheme. We put 50 crore, 20 crore rupees into it and we say, okay, let's get it started and then we'll see how it goes. That approach has led to a plethora of schemes. We have now 685 central sector schemes, which are fully paid for by government, and 30 centrally sponsored schemes, which are paid for by government, but also shared by state governments as a sharing of expenditure. And it's just, if you look at many of these schemes, they're very small schemes, focus on some specific problem. Some of them have been going on for years. Some of them have been around for decades. They've been renamed, put into some umbrella, but still they exist. This approach to expenditure, usually, in my sense, it betrays a lack of strategy on what the government is trying to achieve through expenditure. And at a level of development that we have in India, we need to be very careful about expenditure prioritization. We have a huge amount of demand on expenditure for solving real public good problems, real other market failures addressed on externalities, overcoming information asymmetry problems. Real problems of market failures are remaining unaddressed. And in the process, we are trying to create these cute little schemes on this or that, make sure that Indian students, foreign students can come and study in India. You have some scheme for that. Some Indian students can go abroad and work there, scheme for that. Every social problem, it seems a very political, economic problem, there's some little government scheme that can solve it. And it becomes, over a period of time, it adds up. And there are lots of such schemes where questionable outcomes, even questionable outputs, and go worse, it's not even very questionable inputs also, whether there is a theory that those inputs lead to some change or not. Right. And it will be good, at least, to look at many of these from a fresh pair of eyes and say, what do we want to achieve with them over medium term, say 5 years, and have some kind of a sunset clause built into the schemes that they will be shut down after a point, and then if they will be continued only if there is a real evidence that they are working. And all this machinery is missing right now. It's more of a iterative process which happens year after year after year. You look at last year's allocation, you try to increase it, there's some negotiation, but the strategic approach is missing. And the consequence of that is the 685 central sector. Even there's to be more than 1,000, by the way. Now some of them have merged together and now we have 685.
Wow. So we are getting better.
Only on paper, because merging the scheme doesn't mean that the schemes are less. The work continues, it's just that they have got fewer headings.
On a related issue, I was also struck by the fact that pensions are increasing at such a huge pace in the defense budget. What's going on there? I mean, it's become a fairly large component of the overall defense budget over the past few years.
Yeah. So if you look at there's a larger trend of pensions increasing. There's demographic issues and all behind that. But there was one decision, the one rank one pension decision that was taken, and after that there has been a further an acceleration in the increase in pension outflow of the government, and it's far outpaced the increase in expenditure on defense overall.
Exactly.
So I wrote about this also, that the overall defense expenditure is growing in single digits, some 7-8%, while the defense pensions are growing at some 17-18%,
Right.
something like that. If you look at the last 5 years, the average, the compounded average annual growth rate. So, and because the government has taken a decision to restructure defense pensions altogether on the principle of one rank, one pension, and that will have its fiscal consequences. And my sense is, I've not seen the details on it, but the way the policy was set up, it was going to lead to increase in pension outflow, and a large part of this increase is coming from that.
It seems like a big step back, because for the larger bureaucracy, we introduced the national pension system a while ago to kind of rationalize our pension liabilities so that we could actually not be in this situation for the rest of the bureaucracy.
Yeah, I don't want to relitigate the OROP debate. We've had it, and it went one particular way. But it is true that for the entire bureaucracy outside of the armed forces, you have defined contribution pension, which is contributory. Government co-contributes, and depending on the market returns, you'll get a pension. It's also true of the security forces, which is outside of the military. Paramilitary forces have defined contribution.
Right.
Police forces have. So all of them have that pension, and here we have got a defined benefit pension, which is now also added to an OROP principle to it.
Right. So I want to move on to another theme in this year's budget, which was about building trust around tax administration and the criminal justice system in the economic sector. And there were 2 or 3 big announcements made. One was the implementation or the introduction of a taxpayer charter that would be prepared by the tax department. The other was a scheme to reduce tax litigation, income tax litigation that is currently stuck in tribunals and courts. And the third was about rationalizing criminal offenses in the Companies Act. So can we go through these, each of them quickly, just to see what it's actually going to do or whether it's actually going to have the intended benefit? So, for example, the taxpayer charter, I think the announcement is that there'll be a charter made by the income tax department, which will kind of constrain the behavior of tax officials.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
So what does the charter do? A charter primarily achieves 2 purposes, which are basically 2 sides of the same coin. One purpose is that it clarifies to the taxpayer what rights do they enjoy with respect to the department. And the other side of the same coin is that it also holds the department accountable to the taxpayer about how they should up their game to uphold these rights. Now, what is the situation today? We already have charters. So CBIC, for the indirect tax, we have a charter. The CBDT also has a charter. It's not like the charters are not there. And some of them actually include, if you look at it, specific deadlines for assessments and investigate for responding to taxpayers' assessments and all of that. And what this budget is doing, what the speech says, is that they're putting it in the law, which is they have amended the Income Tax Act to put the charter there. But if you look at it more closely, and I went and looked into the finance bill, which is proposed, it's just one sentence. And it says that the CBDT, which is the authority that's apex authority for direct taxes, is going to adopt and implement a charter. That's all it says. Now just think about it, that if it's totally left to CBDT to adopt and implement it, then how is it going to be different from the current charter?
Right.
If you want to up it a little bit and you want to increase the stakes and increase the accountability, you have to put at least some basic principles of the charter in the law itself.
Right.
Because that law cannot be amended by CBDT, while the charter can be amended and changed by CBDT on its own will. So I think from a design point of view, it's not a good design to make sure that this principal agent problem is managed.
And taxpayers also need some mechanism to be able to enforce this charter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That the law does not say, the amended Income Tax Act is not going to say what are the penalties, what are the avenues for seeking penalties against the department if the charter is not followed. It's like basically given as something that is nice to have.
The other scheme was the Vivad Se Vishwas scheme, which was a kind of amnesty scheme where you basically, the tax department waives off the penalty and interest on the litigated tax assessment if you agree to pay the tax. And the rationale given was that there are about 4 lakh cases in the currently stuck in litigation related to income tax, direct taxes, and that we need to ease the burden of the courts, but also be able to collect some of this revenue. So do you think this is actually going to lead to more trust within the system and also meet the intended objectives of the government?
So if you have an amnesty scheme like this, it could help some people who are tired of going through the litigation. They want to use it and they want to just close the case and move on with their lives. It will help them. It will also help people who are wrong, people who have actually tried to evade taxes, and then they come and they find a cheaper way to solve the problem. They just pay the taxes and move on. I mean, their wrongdoing was didn't get punished with penalties and so on and so forth. But if you are actually law abiding and you are stuck in a dispute, which is actually not a reasonable dispute, I don't think this is a fair way to resolve the problem. So if you look at the data on tax disputes, government is heavily litigious. If in a lower court, if in an appellate tribunal, there is the government loses, it very often appeals. They've changed the thresholds for them recently. Couple of times, 2019 and 2018, they changed the thresholds for appeals, but they're still very, very litigious. That's just one part of it. The other is they lose vast majority of the cases.
Okay.
In the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, which is basically a tribunal comprised of, large number of the people who sit there are ex-revenue officials. Right. It's not the most adversarial of the tribunals for the government's point of view. Government loses 3/4 of the cases. Wow. So it is the government that initiates a lot of these disputes, and because there's an incentive to initiate and continue disputes with the taxpayers, and unless government cleans up its own house and act and make sure that litigation is based on some serious ground and there has to be a serious kind of evidence that somebody has done wrongdoing, just government losing 3/4 of the cases in a tribunal, which is very friendly overall in terms of just the potentially. I don't know how they may be acting independently, but at least if I look at the constitution of the tribunal, I would say that this is not an adversarial and very hostile kind of a tribunal for government. Is a point of to be considered. An amnesty like this disproportionately favors those who actually did wrongdoing because they get a cheaper way out. While if you actually have a wrong tax demand on you and you're fighting against that, why would you settle?
So what you're basically saying is that the amount of litigation we are seeing is a symptom. It's a symptomatic cause of what is actually going on.
There are underlying problems in the way the laws are written, the way the laws are implemented, the way government makes tax demands, the way it chooses to file an appeal or not.
Right. And the third part was a much broader undertaking, which was to try and rationalize some of the offenses under the Companies Act.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. We've not seen the details on it yet. Right. So they've said that they will consider and review and then make the appropriate amendments to the Companies Act. But I think it's very much required. In recent times, we've seen a lot of hue and cry on criminalization of the CSR-related offenses, for example. There is a general problem in India of trying to criminalize a lot of economic activities, which could be just civil offenses. You can just put a penalty and move on, compoundable, make it compoundable. But if they start down this road, there's a lot of cleanup to be done. It'll be good to have it done.
So you can actually make them civil offenses, just pay a penalty and move on. Thank you, Suyash. Before we end, we just wanted to ask you, what are you currently reading that you would like to recommend to our listeners?
So presently, I'm reading this book, Backstage, by Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. who has been a very important feature of a policy landscape. He's a policy economist who's been around in Indian systems in the late 70s. So I'm reading his story about India's reforms and why things were done the way they were done.
Right.
It's a very interesting book.
Thank you, Suyash. Thank you for listening to this episode of Interpreting India, a podcast presented every 2 weeks by Carnegie India. For more information about the podcast and the production team, you can follow us on social media and visit our webpage.